In snow-covered Shelburne, Vermont, a 78-year-old matriarch discovered the true cost of family betrayal on Christmas morning when she found herself deliberately excluded from her own family's portrait. Eleanor Whitman wasn't your typical wealthy widow. For 5 decades, she had built a maple syrup empire, known for her sharp wit and fierce protection of family. When she encountered that pristine photograph without her in it, she had no idea her children had orchestrated her systematic erasure. Eleanor's response would lead to consequences that shattered everything about inheritance and love. What began as exclusion became a lesson in legacy. The Whitman fortune would never be the same. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Whitman's eyes opened to the gray light of Christmas morning, filtering through the frost-etched windows of her Victorian bedroom. At 78, she no longer needed an alarm clock. Her body woke at 5:30 with the precision of a Vermont winter, reliable and unforgiving. The house settled around her with familiar creaks, the old bones of the structure adjusting to the cold that had descended overnight like a judgment. She reached for her silk robe, the one Harold had given her 40 years ago, its burgundy fabric worn soft from decades of Christmas mornings. The hardwood floors felt ice-cold beneath her feet as she padded toward the kitchen, expecting the ritual of solitude that had become her companion since Harold's death 3 years prior. Coffee first, then the careful arrangement of gifts she'd wrapped for a family that would arrive at noon with obligation disguised as affection. But as she passed the formal living room, something stopped her cold. There, on the mantelpiece where she'd placed it religiously for the past 15 years, sat the annual Whitman family Christmas portrait. The silver frame caught the morning light, reflecting it back like an accusation. Eleanor moved closer, her breath catching in her throat as the truth revealed itself with surgical precision. They were all there. David, impeccable in his charcoal suit, standing with the rigid posture of a man perpetually auditioning for respectability. Sarah, soft and kind-eyed, her hand resting on Jessica's shoulder with the protective instinct Eleanor remembered from her daughter's childhood. Miguel, dignified and warm, his presence lending an authenticity to the group that the others seemed to lack. And Jessica, dear Jessica, 16 and luminous with the unguarded beauty of youth, wearing the emerald dress Eleanor had bought her for the occasion. All of them. Everyone except Eleanor herself. The matriarch stared at the portrait, with the intensity of a detective examining evidence. The photographer had arranged them in the formal parlor of David's Beacon Hill townhouse, she realized. The same room where family gatherings had migrated once David decided the Vermont estate was too rustic for serious entertaining. They stood clustered around the antique settee Harold's grandmother had left them, the one Eleanor had reluctantly allowed David to take when he'd insisted it would be better appreciated in his home. Her absence wasn't accidental. This wasn't a hurried snapshot where someone happened to be in the bathroom. This was deliberate, calculated, intentional. 4 generations of Whitman Christmas portraits had included every family member, living and breathing, from great-grandparents down to newborns. The tradition had been Eleanor's idea, started when David and Sarah were small, and Christmas meant magic instead of merely obligation. Now she stood excluded from her own legacy. Eleanor sank into Harold's leather reading chair, the portrait, trembling slightly in her hands. The more she studied it, the more details emerged like symptoms of a disease she'd been too proud to diagnose. David's smile held a satisfaction she'd never noticed before, the expression of a man who'd successfully orchestrated something. Sarah's eyes carried a shadow of discomfort, but her spine remained straight, complicit in whatever decision had led to this moment. Even Miguel, usually her quiet ally in family dynamics, looked directly into the camera without the subtle glance toward the door that might suggest someone was missing. Only Jessica seemed wrong somehow. Her smile appeared forced, her usual animated energy dampened into something resembling duty. The phone call came back to her then, 3 weeks ago, when David had mentioned the portrait session with casual indifference. "We're doing the family photo this Saturday, Mother. The photographer comes highly recommended. Very exclusive. Unfortunately, it's quite last minute, and I know how you feel about short notice." She'd felt a flicker of irritation at his presumption, but Christmas portraits had always been scheduled months in advance. "What time should I arrive?" "Oh." A pause that should have warned her. "Actually, we thought this year we'd try something more intimate. Just the immediate family, you understand." At the time, she'd been too stunned to argue. Immediate family. As if she, the woman who'd built this family, who'd nurtured it through Harold's long hours building their maple syrup empire, who'd sacrificed social events and personal desires to ensure David and Sarah had every advantage, was somehow peripheral to its definition. Eleanor set the portrait on the side table and walked to the kitchen window. Outside, snow fell in thick, determined flakes, blanketing the maple groves that stretched toward the mountains. This land had been in Harold's family for 5 generations. She'd learned every tree, every seasonal shift, every secret the forest held. She'd built a business empire here, raised children here, buried her husband in the family plot just beyond the hill where the sugar house stood. Yet somehow, she'd become a stranger in her own story. The phone rang, jarring her from her reverie. David's number appeared on the caller ID, and Eleanor felt her spine straighten automatically, a response trained by decades of navigating her son's moods. "Merry Christmas, Mother." "David." She kept her voice neutral, though her grip on the phone tightened. "I see the portrait arrived." "Yes, turned out quite well, didn't it? Morrison is really an artist with lighting." The casual tone made her stomach clench. "Quite well," she repeated slowly. "Though I notice it seems to be missing something." A beat of silence. "Missing something?" "I'm not sure what you mean." Eleanor closed her eyes. Even now, he would make her spell it out, force her to name her own exclusion like a plaintiff, presenting evidence of her own irrelevance. "I mean me, David. The portrait is missing me." "Oh, that." His voice carried the dismissive tone she'd learned to recognize as his signal that a conversation was over before it began. "Well, as I mentioned, we wanted something more contemporary this year. More focused." "Focused on what, exactly?" "The core family unit. You know how these things work, Mother. Too many people and the composition becomes cluttered. Too many people. As if she were furniture that no longer fit the decor." "I see. I knew you'd understand. You've always been practical about these things." "Practical?" Yes, that's what she'd always been. Practical when Harold worked 18-hour days and she managed the household alone. Practical when David's law school loans needed paying and Sarah's wedding required financing. Practical when the family business demanded expansion and she'd mortgaged sentiment for success. "Will we see you at noon?" David continued, already moving past the conversation as if her concerns were as insignificant as the weather. "I wouldn't miss it," Eleanor said, though something in her tone made the words sound less like acceptance than a promise. After she hung up, Eleanor stood in the kitchen that had been the heart of her home for 50 years. The morning light revealed everything in sharp detail. The copper pots she'd collected from trips to Europe, the farmhouse table where she'd helped with homework and sorted business papers, the chair where Harold used to read her passages from the newspaper while she cooked breakfast. All of it suddenly felt like evidence of a life that had been edited out of its own conclusion. Eleanor walked deliberately to Harold's study, her bare feet silent on the Turkish carpet he'd chosen, because he said it reminded him of her. Complex, beautiful, and built to last. The room still smelled faintly of his cologne and the pipe tobacco. He'd claimed to have quit, but never actually abandoned. His leather chair sat behind the mahogany desk like a throne awaiting its rightful occupant. She opened the bottom drawer and retrieved the safe's key from its hiding place behind Harold's first edition Thoreau. The safe opened with a soft click, revealing the documents that governed their family's future. Insurance policies, investment, statements, and at the very center, the thick envelope containing their will. Eleanor had always prided herself on practical estate planning. The will distributed their considerable wealth with mathematical precision, the maple syrup business and land to David as the eldest son, substantial trusts for Sarah and Jessica, charitable donations that reflected their values, provisions for Dot's retirement. Everything organized, everything fair, everything designed to secure the family's legacy for generations. But as she held the document in her hands, Eleanor realized something had fundamentally shifted. This wasn't just about a Christmas portrait. This was about being systematically erased from the family narrative while still alive to witness it. The snow continued falling outside Harold's window, covering the landscape in pristine white. Beautiful. Perfect. Cold as the reception she'd received from her own children. Eleanor placed the will on Harold's desk and stared at it for a long moment. Then she reached for the phone. It was time to make some changes. After all, as David had pointed out, she'd always been practical about these things. Eleanor's hand lingered on the phone receiver long after the dial tone faded. The weight of her decision settled around her like the snow accumulating outside Harold's study window. She'd made the call to Bobby Caldwell's office, her voice steady as she requested an immediate meeting. "It's urgent," she'd told his secretary, and the woman, who'd known the Whitman family for years, had heard something in Eleanor's tone that cleared Bobby's schedule without question. The drive to downtown Shelburne took 15 minutes through streets lined with Victorian homes dressed in holiday splendor. Wreaths hung on every door, lights twinkled from every window, and the whole scene felt like a Norman Rockwell painting designed to mock her current reality. Eleanor parked her Mercedes in front of Bobby's modest brick building, noting how the holiday decorations in his office window seemed to sneer at her through the frosted glass. Bobby Caldwell's law practice occupied the second floor of a building that had housed lawyers for over a century. The worn wooden stairs creaked under Eleanor's measured steps, each sound echoing like a countdown to something irreversible. She found Bobby's secretary, Mrs. Patterson, arranging poinsettias on the reception desk with the focused attention of someone trying to avoid acknowledging the tension radiating from her unexpected visitor. "Mrs. Whitman," Bobby emerged from his office, concern creasing his weathered features. At 45, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd chosen substance over flash. His office reflected that choice. Comfortable leather chairs worn smooth by decades of clients, law books that showed actual use, and a desk scarred by the honest work of small-town legal practice. Bobby. Eleanor settled into the chair across. From his desk, her posture erect despite the emotional weight she carried. "Thank you for seeing me on Christmas morning." "Of course." Bobby poured coffee from a thermos. Clearly, he'd anticipated a long conversation. "What's troubling you, Eleanor?" She reached into her purse and withdrew the Christmas portrait, placing it on his desk like evidence in a trial. Bobby studied it, his expression shifting from curiosity to understanding to something approaching anger. "They left you out. Deliberately." The word carried decades of accumulated hurt. David orchestrated it, called it making the portrait more focused. Bobby leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. He'd handled the Whitman family's legal affairs for 15 years, had witnessed the gradual shift from genuine affection to calculated obligation. "Eleanor, I'm sorry, this is unforgivable." Eleanor's voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. "I want David removed from the will. Completely." The request hung in the air between them like a challenge. Bobby had seen estate disputes tear families apart, had witnessed the devastating power of inheritance used as a weapon. But he'd also seen Eleanor at her most vulnerable moments, signing Harold's death certificate, navigating the loneliness of widowhood, struggling with the realization that her children's visits had become increasingly transactional. Eleanor, that's a significant decision. Your estate is substantial and David's been counting on… Counting on what? His inheritance? Eleanor's eyes flashed with the steel that had built an empire. Perhaps that's the problem. He spent so much time counting on things that he forgot to count the cost of his actions. Bobby reached for a legal pad, then set it aside. Tell me what happened. All of it. Eleanor's composure cracked slightly as she recounted the phone call, David's casual dismissal, the calculated nature of her exclusion. I built this family, Bobby. Harold and I sacrificed everything to give our children opportunities we never had. We worked 18-hour days so they could attend the best schools, travel to Europe, marry well. I mortgaged sentiment for their security. And now? Now I'm clutter in their composition. The phrase tasted bitter. Too many people, David said, as if I'm excess furniture that no longer fits their aesthetic. Bobby watched her carefully. In 15 years of legal practice, he'd learned to read the difference between momentary anger and fundamental betrayal. Eleanor's pain ran deeper than wounded pride. This was about the systematic erosion of her place in the family narrative. You understand this isn't just about money, Bobby said gently. Removing David from the will sends a message that can't be taken back. Good. Perhaps it's time someone in this family received a message they couldn't dismiss or ignore. What? About Sarah? Jessica? The ripple effects. We'll teach them that actions have consequences. Eleanor straightened further, if that was possible. I've spent decades enabling their comfortable indifference. Maybe it's time they learned what loss actually feels like. Bobby studied the portrait again, noting the satisfied expression on David's face, the uncomfortable shadow in Sarah's eyes. This photo session, Sarah was there? Silent as a grave. My daughter, who counsels families in crisis for a living, couldn't find the courage to speak up for her own mother. The irony wasn't lost on Bobby. Sarah Rodriguez worked for Vermont, family services, helping broken families heal, yet she'd stood by while her own family fractured. Eleanor, I have to ask, are you certain this is what you want? Once we begin this process, it becomes real very quickly. Eleanor reached across the desk and turned the portrait to face Bobby directly. Look at that photograph and tell me it isn't already real. Bobby saw what she meant. The composition was perfect, the lighting professional, the poses carefully arranged. It was a portrait of a family that had edited out its inconvenient matriarch while she was still alive to witness her own erasure. All right. Bobby pulled out a fresh legal pad. But I want you to think carefully about the scope of this. Are we talking about David alone? Or are there others? Start with David. We'll see how the rest of them respond to his consequences. As Bobby began taking notes, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of agency in her own story. For too long, she'd been a supporting character in her children's lives, a source of stability and resources they took for granted. The portrait had crystallized a truth she'd been avoiding. They saw her as optional. The maple syrup business, Bobby asked, was always intended for David as the eldest son. That changes now. The Vermont properties? Same. David assumed he'd inherit the family land. Now he can assume otherwise. Bobby continued documenting her instructions, each decision stripping away layers of David's presumed future. The irony was precise. David had excluded his mother from the family portrait, so Eleanor was excluding him from the family legacy. Eleanor, Bobby set down his pen. I need to ask this as your attorney and your friend. Is this justice, or is this revenge? The question cut to the heart of her uncertainty. Eleanor considered it, weighing the hurt of exclusion against the satisfaction of retaliation. Does the distinction matter if the result is the same? It matters to you. I've known you long enough to recognize when you're acting from your principles versus your pain. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, watching snow collect on Bobby's office window. My whole life, I've been practical. I've made decisions based on what was best for the family, not what felt good for me. I've swallowed pride, ignored slights, and enabled behavior I should have confronted years ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And now? Now I'm tired of being practical. I'm tired of being taken for granted. I'm tired of loving people who treat that love like a renewable resource they can waste without consequence. Bobby finished his notes and looked up at Eleanor with the expression of someone who understood the weight of irreversible decisions. I'll draft the changes, but I want you to sit with this for 24 hours before we file anything. Once this becomes official, it becomes real, Eleanor finished. Bobby, it became real the moment they decided I wasn't worth including in their perfect family portrait. As Eleanor left Bobby's office, the snow had intensified, transforming Shelburne into a winter wonderland that felt anything but wonderful. She drove home through streets where every house glowed with warm light and holiday cheer, past families probably gathering for Christmas dinner with inclusion rather than exclusion on the menu. The portrait still sat on her mantelpiece when she returned, a testament to her family's capacity for calculated cruelty. But now it felt different. Not like evidence of her irrelevance, but like proof that she'd been underestimating her own worth for far too long. Eleanor picked up the portrait and carried it to Harold's study, where she placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk next to the will that would soon reflect a very different vision of the Whitman family legacy. Some photographs, she realized, were worth more than the paper they were printed on. They were worth the truth they revealed about the people who posed for them. And some truths, once revealed, demanded consequences that would reshape everything that came after. Eleanor's hand turned the brass doorknob to the kitchen, where the scent of cinnamon and brown sugar greeted her like an embrace. Dot Henderson stood at the stove, her silver hair pinned back with characteristic efficiency, stirring what Eleanor recognized as her famous bread pudding, a Christmas tradition that had outlasted marriages, deaths, and now, apparently, family portraits. "Wondered when you'd make it back," Dot said without turning around, her Georgia accent still faintly audible after 30 years in Vermont. "Coffee's fresh. Figured you might need it after your morning constitutional." Eleanor poured herself a cup from the blue ceramic pot. The kitchen felt like a sanctuary, copper pots hanging from hooks Harold had installed, herbs growing in mason jars on the windowsill, and the worn pine table where more honest conversations had taken place than in all the other rooms combined. "Constitutional," Eleanor repeated, settling into her usual chair. "Is that what we're calling it?" Dot finally turned, her brown eyes sharp with intelligence. At 72, she moved with purposeful economy, someone who'd spent a lifetime managing other people's chaos while maintaining her own dignity. "Well, I figure a woman doesn't drive to town on Christmas morning in a snowstorm unless she's either having a breakdown or making a declaration. And you're too stubborn for breakdowns." "I went to see Bobby Caldwell." Dot's stirring slowed fractionally. "Legal business on Christmas morning. Must be important. I'm having David removed from the will." Dot set down her wooden spoon, entirely, crossing her arms. "All right. What did that boy do now?" Eleanor retrieved the portrait from her purse and placed it on the kitchen table. Dot studied the photograph with forensic attention, her expression darkening. "They left you out." "Deliberately. David said it was about creating a more focused composition." Dot picked up the portrait, examining each face. "Look at Jessica's face. That child's uncomfortable as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Eleanor hadn't noticed it before, but Dot was right. Jessica's smile appeared forced, her usual animated energy dampened. You think she knew? Honey, that girl idolizes you. You think she'd stand for this if she had any say in the matter? Dot set the portrait down gently. But she's 16. What power does she have against her daddy's decisions? 30 years I've been in this house, Dot continued, moving back to her bread pudding. 30 years I've watched you build this family up, sacrifice your own desires for their security, and enable behavior that should have been corrected decades ago. Enabled how? Eleanor asked, though she suspected she knew. You think I haven't noticed how David talks to you? How he dismisses your opinions, rolls his eyes when you're not looking, treats you like an inconvenience he has to manage rather than the woman who made his entire life possible. Dot's voice carried decades of suppressed frustration. And Sarah, bless her heart, she means well. But she's so afraid of conflict that she'd rather let injustice slide than deal with uncomfortable conversations. Eleanor felt familiar tightness in her chest. I thought I was keeping the peace. You were keeping the facade. There's a difference. Dot ladled bread pudding into a serving bowl. You want to know what I think? I think you stopped expecting. Respect from your children so gradually that you didn't notice when they stopped giving it. The accusation hit harder than Eleanor expected because it contained uncomfortable truth. When had she begun accepting dismissive treatment as normal? When had she started apologizing for taking up space in conversations, for having opinions, for simply existing in her children's refined world? I remember when David was 7, Dot continued, and he threw a tantrum because you wouldn't buy him some expensive toy. You told him that money didn't grow on trees, that he needed to learn the value of things. But by the time he was 17, you were writing checks for whatever he wanted, because you didn't want him to feel deprived. Eleanor remembered. David's acceptance to Harvard had come with substantial expenses, and she'd wanted him to fit in with his privileged classmates. The same pattern had continued through law school, his wedding, the down payment on his Beacon Hill townhouse. And Sarah, Dot's voice softened slightly. She's got a good heart, but she learned early that being the peacekeeper earned approval. Problem is, you can't make peace by ignoring problems. You just make them bigger. Eleanor traced her coffee. Cup's rim, processing 30 years of family dynamics through Dot's unflinching perspective. So you think I created this situation? I think you're a woman who loved her children so much that you forgot to teach them how to love you back. Dot sat down across from Eleanor. There's a difference between unconditional love and unconditional enabling. The distinction felt crucial. What would you have done differently? I'd have set boundaries. I'd have demanded respect instead of hoping for it. I'd have let them experience consequences instead of cushioning every blow. Dot reached across the table and covered Eleanor's hand. But I'm not judging you, honey. Changing your will might be the first honest boundary you've set with David in decades. Eleanor felt tears threaten for the first time since discovering the portrait. Am I doing the right thing? That depends. Are you doing it to teach him something or to hurt him back? The question echoed Bobby's concern about justice versus revenge. Both, maybe. Is that wrong? It's human, Dot said simply. But you need to be clear about what you're hoping to accomplish. If you want to punish David, cutting him out will certainly do that. If you want to change his behavior, well, that's more complicated. Eleanor thought about David's casual dismissal. That morning, what if I want both? Then you better be prepared for the consequences. This affects the whole family. Sarah's going to feel caught in the middle. Jessica's going to be heartbroken that her family's falling apart. Each name felt like a weight, added to Eleanor's decision. But, Dot continued, Sometimes families need to fall apart a little before they can come back together in a healthier way. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is refuse to enable dysfunction, even if it creates short-term pain. Eleanor looked around the kitchen that had been the heart of her home for 50 years. How many family meals, homework sessions, late-night conversations had this room witnessed? The kitchen held memory of genuine connection before relationships became transactions. "I miss who we used to be," Eleanor said quietly. "I know you do. But you can't go backward. You can only decide who you want to be going forward." Dot squeezed Eleanor's hand. "The question is, do you want to be the woman who accepts being erased from her own family's story, or do you want to be the woman who demands to be seen?" Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, not brittle determination, but something deeper and more sustainable. For the first time in years, she felt connected to her own power, rather than diminished by her children's indifference. "I want to be seen," she said. "Then you're going to have to make some noise. Quiet dignity doesn't work on people who've learned to ignore it." As if summoned by their conversation, Eleanor's phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the caller ID, and Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with anticipation. Eleanor looked at Dot, who nodded encouragingly. "Might as well start practicing that boundary setting we talked about." With Dot's steady presence anchoring her, Eleanor answered the phone, ready to discover whether her daughter would prove to be an ally or just another casualty of the comfortable lies they'd all been telling themselves for far too long. Eleanor answered the phone, ready to discover whether her daughter would prove to be an ally or another casualty of comfortable lies. But Sarah's voice carried a tremor that immediately shifted the conversation's expected trajectory. "Mom, I just got off the phone with David. He said you were upset about the portrait and I—" Sarah's words tumbled together in the rushed cadence of someone trying to prevent an explosion. "I wanted to call before the family dinner. I think there might be some misunderstanding." Eleanor felt Dot's encouraging presence beside her, a reminder of the boundary-setting conversation they'd just finished. "What kind of misunderstanding would that be, Sarah?" "Well, David said you felt excluded, but it wasn't personal. The photographer had specific requirements about group size, and the lighting setup couldn't accommodate—" "Stop." Eleanor's voice carried an authority that surprised them both. "Don't do this, Sarah. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was about lighting." Silence stretched across the line. Eleanor could hear Sarah's breath catching, the sound of someone realizing their carefully prepared script had just been rejected. "Mom, I know you're hurt, but..." "But what? But I should understand? But I should accept being erased from my own family's Christmas tradition because it's more convenient for everyone else? That's not what I meant." Sarah's voice grew smaller. "I just think maybe we're all overreacting." Eleanor closed her eyes, remembering Dot's words about enabling versus loving. Here was Sarah, doing exactly what Dot had described, smoothing over injustice to avoid uncomfortable conversations, treating Eleanor's legitimate hurt as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a wrong to be addressed. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. When you stood for that photograph, when you posed with your family while I was deliberately excluded, what were you thinking?" Another pause. When Sarah spoke again, her voice carried the weight of suppressed guilt. "I was thinking that I didn't want to cause a scene." "A scene." Eleanor repeated the phrase, tasting its implications. "So my presence would have been a scene, but my absence was just convenient?" "No, that's not..." Sarah's voice broke. Slightly. "Mom, you know I love you. You know I never wanted to hurt you. But you did hurt me. And more importantly, you let your brother hurt me because confronting him would have been uncomfortable for you." Eleanor could hear Sarah crying now, soft sounds of someone confronting an uncomfortable truth. "I should have said something. I know I should have said something." For a moment, Eleanor felt her resolve waver. This was her daughter, her baby, girl who had always been sensitive and kind-hearted. Sarah's tears triggered decades of maternal instinct to comfort, to smooth over pain, to make everything better. But then she thought about the portrait, about David's satisfied expression, about her own absence from the family narrative. She thought about Dot's words about boundaries and enabling. "Yes, you should have," Eleanor said gently but firmly. "And the fact that you didn't tells me something important about how this family has been functioning." "What do you mean?" "I mean that somewhere along the way, we all learned that it's easier to hurt me than to confront each other. I became the acceptable casualty in every family conflict because I was the one who could be counted on to forgive, to understand, to keep the peace no matter what it cost me personally." Sarah's crying intensified. "I never thought of it that way." "Of course you didn't. That's how these patterns work. They become invisible until someone finally refuses to participate." Eleanor looked at Dot, who nodded encouragingly. "Sarah, I need you to know that I'm making some changes." "What kind of changes?" Eleanor hesitated. Bobby had advised her to sit with her decision for 24 hours before making anything official. But Sarah's tears, her genuine distress, made Eleanor wonder if there might be hope for authentic reconciliation with at least one of her children. "I've been thinking about what kind of legacy I want to leave," Eleanor said carefully. "Not just money, but what kind of family relationships I want to model for Jessica's generation." "Mom, you're scaring me. Are you sick? Is something wrong with your health?" The immediate leap to medical crisis told Eleanor everything about how her family viewed her, as a resource to be preserved rather than a person to be respected. "My health is fine, Sarah. What's not fine is how this family treats each other. I know I messed up with the portrait. I know I should have spoken up. But can't we fix this? Can't we just take another photo? Include you this time?" Eleanor almost laughed at the suggestion, as if the problem could be solved with better staging, as if the underlying dysfunction could be erased with improved composition. "Sarah, this isn't about a photograph. This is about the fact that your brother felt comfortable excluding me, and you felt comfortable letting him do it. It's about patterns of behavior that have been building for years." "So what are you saying? That you don't want to see us anymore?" "I'm saying that I don't want to see you under the current conditions anymore. I don't want family gatherings where I'm tolerated rather than welcomed. I don't want relationships where my feelings are optional considerations. I don't want to be the grandmother who gets included when it's convenient and excluded when it's not." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried a new quality, less defensive, more thoughtful. "What would you want instead?" The question surprised Eleanor with its directness. "I want family members who notice when I'm hurting and care enough to address it. I want children who stand up for me when I'm being mistreated, even if it creates conflict. I want relationships based on genuine affection rather than obligated tolerance. And if we can't give you that?" Eleanor felt the weight of the moment, the recognition that her answer would determine whether this was the beginning of healing or the end of relationships she'd spent decades building. "Then I suppose we'll all have to live with the consequences of that choice." After she hung up, Eleanor sat in the kitchen silence with Dot, both women processing the conversation's implications. Sarah's tears had been genuine, her guilt real, her desire to fix things apparent. But Eleanor had also heard the underlying assumption that the solution lay in better management of Eleanor's feelings rather than fundamental change in family dynamics. "How did it feel?" Dot asked quietly. "Terrifying," Eleanor admitted, "but also liberating. For the first time in years, I told the truth about what I need instead of pretending to be satisfied with what I was getting." "And Sarah?" "Sarah wants to make things better, but I'm not sure she understands that better requires more than just inclusion in the next family photo." Dot nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who have the hardest time seeing how they've been hurting us. Love can be blind to its own damage. Eleanor looked around the kitchen one more time, then stood up with sudden determination. I think I need to take a walk through the house. I need to remember some things before the family arrives. As Eleanor left the kitchen, she carried with her both the weight of difficult truths and the lightness of finally speaking them aloud. The house awaited her exploration, its rooms filled with decades of memories that might help her understand how a family built on love had somehow learned to function without it. Eleanor left the kitchen's warmth and began her pilgrimage through the house, each room holding fragments of a family history she was only now learning to see clearly. The late afternoon light slanted through frost-covered windows, casting everything in the golden amber of memory and regret. She started in the formal living room, where the absent portrait had sat like an accusation that morning. But now her eyes found other photographs, decades of Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations, graduations. In the earliest pictures, David and Sarah clustered around her and Harold with genuine delight, their faces bright with uncomplicated love. When had that changed? When had their smiles become performances? Eleanor picked up a silver-framed photo from David's 8th birthday. He sat on her lap, chocolate cake smeared across his grin, while she laughed at something he'd whispered in her ear. The intimacy in that moment felt like a relic from another family entirely. She remembered that day with crystalline clarity. David had wanted an expensive bicycle that Harold thought was too extravagant. But Eleanor had seen the longing in her son's eyes and secretly bought the bike, hiding it in the barn until his birthday morning. The joy on David's face when he'd seen it had made every penny worthwhile. He'd thrown his arms around her neck and promised to love her forever. "You're the best mom in the whole world," he'd whispered. But something had changed. When? How? Eleanor climbed the stairs, her hand trailing along the banister Harold had carved by hand during their first winter. She paused at Sarah's childhood bedroom, the door still painted the soft yellow Sarah had chosen at age 10. The room had been preserved exactly as Sarah left it for college, a shrine to the daughter who'd been Eleanor's confidant, her gentle soul, her hope for healing the family's growing fractures. On Sarah's desk sat a framed photo from her high school graduation. Eleanor studied her daughter's face, noting how 17-year-old Sarah gazed at her mother with open admiration. When had that look been replaced by careful distance? When had Sarah learned that loving Eleanor required managing Eleanor's expectations, rather than simply being present? Eleanor remembered supporting Sarah's choice to major in social work despite David's pressure to choose something more practical. Now the irony cut deep. Sarah had built a career helping broken families communicate, yet she couldn't find courage to speak up when her own family fractured. Eleanor moved to David's room, painted navy blue with Harvard pennants still tacked to the walls. She sat on his twin bed, remembering the night before he left for law school when he'd confessed his fears about living up to expectations. "What if I'm not smart enough?" he'd asked, his usual confidence cracking. "What if I disappoint you and Dad?" Eleanor had held him that night, stroking his hair. "You could never disappoint us," she'd whispered. "We love you for who you are, not for what you achieve." But had that been true? Eleanor forced herself to examine the uncomfortable possibility that she and Harold had gradually shifted their love from unconditional to performance-based. David's successes had brought them such pride. Harvard Law Review, the prestigious Boston firm, his marriage to Victoria's old money family. Had they inadvertently taught him that achievement was the price of their approval? Eleanor opened David's desk drawer and found childhood treasures, Little League trophies, a dried corsage, and at the bottom, a construction paper card from Mother's Day when he was 6. The crayon letters were faded but legible. "Dear Mom, you are the nicest mom ever. I love you more than all the stars. Love, David." The simple words hit her like a physical blow. This was the same boy who had dismissed her pain that morning, who had orchestrated her exclusion. Somewhere between the innocent love of that card and the calculated cruelty of Christmas morning, they had lost each other. Eleanor descended to Harold's study and opened the desk drawer where she'd hidden the offensive portrait. Beside it lay photographs from Jessica's birth 16 years ago. Eleanor smiled despite her pain, remembering how Jessica had arrived 3 weeks early. In the photos, Eleanor held her newborn granddaughter with the expertise of a woman who'd raised 2 children, but the wonder of someone encountering love for the first time. David appeared in several shots, looking exhausted but genuinely happy, as he watched his mother cradle his daughter. There was no performance in his face, no calculation, just a man grateful that his mother knew how to soothe a crying baby when he felt helpless. Jessica had been the bridge between them for a while, a shared love that required no negotiation. But even that relationship had become complicated as David began controlling when and how Eleanor could see her granddaughter. Eleanor found a letter from the back of the drawer, something she'd written to Harold on their 40th anniversary, but never given him. My dearest Harold, I look at David and Sarah and see the best of both of us. I know we made mistakes, pushed too hard sometimes, expected too much. But we raised children who will make their own families better than ours ever was. They'll remember the love even if they forget the pressure. Eleanor set the letter down with trembling hands. How wrong she'd been. David and Sarah hadn't built on the foundation she and Harold had provided. They'd inherited its flaws while discarding its love. But Jessica represented hope for breaking the cycle. In her granddaughter's honest questions and unguarded affection, Eleanor saw the possibility of authentic relationship. Jessica hadn't yet learned that love came with conditions. Eleanor heard cars pulling into the driveway, her family arriving for Christmas dinner. Through the study window, she watched David emerge from his BMW, straightening his tie as if preparing for a business meeting. Sarah climbed out of Miguel's Toyota, her shoulders tense with anticipation. Miguel helped Jessica carry wrapped presents, his gentle demeanor a stark contrast to the family dynamic swirling around him. Eleanor remained seated in Harold's chair, surrounded by evidence of love given and love lost, of a family that had somehow forgotten how to see each other clearly. The portrait upstairs represented the culmination of years of gradual erosion, not a sudden betrayal, but the final collapse of relationships that had been weakening for decades. But Eleanor was no longer the same woman who had discovered that portrait this morning. The conversations with Bobby and Dot, the difficult honesty with Sarah, the journey through her own memories had crystallized something essential. She deserved better than toleration disguised as love. The doorbell rang, though her family had keys and had never bothered with formal announcements before. Perhaps David's need to maintain control extended even to how they entered her house. Eleanor smiled grimly and rose from Harold's chair, straightening, her shoulders like a general preparing for battle. It was time to discover whether her family was capable of the kind of honesty that might save them all, or whether this Christmas dinner would mark the beginning of the end of relationships that had already died in everything but name. Eleanor opened the front door to find her family arranged like actors awaiting their cue. David stood at the center, his charcoal wool coat pristine despite the snow, his expression carrying the patient condescension of someone prepared to manage an elderly relative's holiday dramatics. Sarah hovered behind him, her eyes red-rimmed, from crying, while Miguel carried most of the gifts with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd learned to navigate family tensions by staying useful. But it was Jessica who broke Eleanor's heart. Her granddaughter stood slightly apart from the others, her emerald dress, the one Eleanor had bought her, wrinkled as if she'd been fidgeting nervously. Jessica's usual bright energy was subdued, her eyes darting between the adults with the wariness of someone who'd sensed impending conflict. "Merry Christmas, Mother," David said, stepping forward to offer his cheek for the obligatory kiss. The gesture felt as rehearsed as everything else about him. Eleanor accepted the kiss but studied his face, noting the slight tension around his eyes that suggested Sarah had indeed called him after their conversation. "David, please, come in, all of you." They filed into the foyer, and Eleanor watched. Them shed their winter coats with the careful choreography of people who'd performed this ritual countless times. But something felt different today, an undercurrent of anticipation that made even routine actions feel significant. "Grandma Elle!" Jessica broke free from the group's formal restraint and wrapped Eleanor in a genuine hug. The spontaneous affection hit Eleanor like a lifeline, reminding her why she was fighting for authentic relationships. "I missed you. Dad said you weren't feeling well this morning." Eleanor met David's eyes over Jessica's head, noting his slight nod. Apparently, he'd chosen illness as an explanation for her absence from his narrative. "I'm feeling much better now, sweetheart. Much clearer about things." Miguel approached, with his usual warmth, embracing Eleanor with the careful affection of someone who'd earned his place in this family through patience rather than birthright. "Eleanor, you look beautiful. The house smells incredible. Dot's been cooking all day. Hasn't she?" "She has. Though I suspect we'll all find we have more appetite for honesty than food tonight." The comment landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of tension through the group. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, while Sarah's breathing quickened. Miguel, however, simply nodded as if he'd been expecting something like this. They moved to the living room, where Dot had arranged appetizers and where the empty space on the mantelpiece seemed to pulse with significance. Eleanor noticed David's gaze go immediately to the spot where the portrait had sat, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching concern. "Mother, where's the Christmas portrait? I thought you'd want to display it prominently." Eleanor settled into Harold's reading chair, the one that gave her the best view of everyone in the room. "I moved it somewhere more appropriate. Somewhere it could be properly appreciated for what it represents." "What does that mean?" David's lawyer instincts were kicking in, his tone shifting from social pleasantry to cross-examination mode. "It means I've spent the day thinking about family portraits, David. About who gets included, who gets excluded, and what those choices say about the people making them." Sarah shifted uncomfortably on the sofa beside Miguel. "Mom, we talked about this. I thought we agreed that it was just a misunderstanding." "No, Sarah. You talked. You explained. You managed. But we didn't agree on anything." Eleanor's voice remained calm, but her words carried the weight of decades of accumulated clarity. "We've spent years having conversations where you all explained to me why I should accept whatever treatment you choose to give me. Tonight, I'd like to try something different." Jessica looked between the adults with growing alarm. "What's happening? Why is everyone acting weird?" Eleanor's heart ached for her granddaughter, but she also recognized that Jessica needed to see this, needed to witness what authentic communication looked like, even when it was difficult. "Your father made a choice about this year's family portrait, Jessica. He decided that I shouldn't be included. When I asked him about it, he told me I was being dramatic. When your Aunt Sarah saw what was happening, she chose to stay quiet rather than speak up for me." David's face flushed with anger. "Mother, that's not... You're oversimplifying a complex situation. The photographer had specific requirements." "Stop." Eleanor's voice cut through his explanation with surgical precision. "Don't insult my intelligence or your daughter's by pretending this was about photography. You excluded me because you're embarrassed by me. Because I don't fit the image you want to project of your successful, refined family." "That's ridiculous," David protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it? When was the last time you introduced me to your colleagues without prefacing it with explanations about my old-fashioned ways or my strong opinions? When was the last time you invited me to one of your social events without treating it as a favor you were granting rather than a relationship you were nurturing?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. Jessica stared at her father with dawning understanding, her young face registering the kind of disappointment that cuts deeper than anger. "Dad? Is that true?" David looked at his daughter, then at Eleanor, his composure finally beginning to crack. "Jessica, adults have complicated relationships. Sometimes we make choices that seem harsh but are actually about protecting—" "Protecting who?" Eleanor interrupted. "Protecting me from what exactly? From being seen? From taking up space in your carefully curated life?" Miguel spoke for the first time since entering the living room. "Eleanor, what do you need from us tonight?" The question was so direct, so free of defensiveness or explanation, that it stopped the escalating argument cold. Everyone turned to look at Miguel, whose teacher's instincts had identified the core issue with startling clarity. Eleanor felt tears threaten for the first time that day. Someone had finally asked what she needed rather than explaining why she shouldn't need it. "I need to know if this family is capable of loving me as I am, rather than tolerating me as a burden. I need to know if my children can see me as a person worthy of consideration, rather than a problem to be managed." She looked directly at David. "And I need to know if you're capable of taking responsibility for the choices you've made, instead of hiding behind elaborate justifications." David's silence stretched long enough that Jessica filled it. "Grandma L, I would never let anyone—" "Leave you out of a family picture, that's mean." Out of the mouths of babes. Jessica's simple moral clarity cut through all the adult complexity and exposed the situation for what it truly was. A choice between kindness and cruelty, between inclusion and exclusion, between love and indifference. Eleanor reached across the space between her chair and the sofa and took Jessica's hand. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means more to me than you know." But as she held her granddaughter's hand, Eleanor also made a decision that would change everything. Tonight's conversation had confirmed what she'd suspected all day. This family was broken in ways that required more than gentle correction. They needed consequences that would force them to confront the cost of their choices. It was time to show them what exclusion really felt like. Eleanor released Jessica's hand and rose from Harold's chair with the deliberate movements of someone who had reached an irrevocable decision. The room fell silent as she walked to Harold's mahogany secretary desk in the corner, her family watching with the tense attention of people sensing something momentous approaching. "I want to show you all something," Eleanor said, opening the desk drawer and retrieving a manila envelope thick with legal documents. "This morning, after I discovered your beautiful family portrait, I paid a visit to Bobby Caldwell." David's face went pale. As a lawyer, he understood the significance of Christmas morning legal consultations in ways the others didn't. "Mother, what did you do?" "I did what any reasonable person would do when they realize they've been systematically excluded from their own family's narrative." Eleanor returned to her chair, the envelope balanced on her lap like evidence in a trial. "I updated my estate planning to reflect current realities." Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. "What kind of updates?" Eleanor opened the envelope and withdrew several documents, their official legal formatting unmistakable even from across the room. "Well, let's see. The maple syrup business that was intended for David as the eldest son, that's been redirected to Jessica's education fund and a charitable foundation for family counseling services." David shot to his feet, his composure finally shattering. Completely. "You can't be serious. That business has been in our family for 5 generations. And it will continue to be. Jessica is family. She's the only one in this room who seems to understand what family actually means." Eleanor's voice remained steady, but her eyes blazed with the authority of someone who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. "The Vermont properties, including this house, will also go to Jessica when she turns 25, with provisions for Dot's lifetime residence and care." Miguel placed a restraining hand on Sarah's arm as she started to speak. His teacher's instincts recognized that Eleanor wasn't finished, and interruptions would only make things worse. The investment accounts that were designated for David's children's college funds have been redirected to Jessica exclusively, since she appears to be the only grandchild who knows how to treat her grandmother with basic human decency. Jessica looked stricken, her 16-year-old mind struggling to process the magnitude of what was happening. Grandma L, I don't want money. I just want our family to stop fighting. Eleanor's expression softened as she looked at her granddaughter. I know you do, sweetheart, but sometimes families need to face consequences before they can learn to stop fighting. David began pacing, his lawyer's mind calculating the financial implications with devastating clarity. Mother, this is millions of dollars. You're talking about dismantling everything Dad worked for, everything our family built. Everything your father and I built, Eleanor corrected sharply. While you were learning to be embarrassed by the woman who made your privileged life possible. Sarah finally found her voice, though it trembled with emotion. Mom? I know I should have spoken up about the portrait. I know I was wrong. But this seems like such an extreme reaction. Extreme? Eleanor's laugh carried no humor. Sarah, you stood by and watched your brother exclude me from my own family's Christmas portrait, and you think my reaction is extreme? You work with broken families every day, helping them communicate and heal. Yet when your own family breaks apart in front of you, you choose silence over courage. Miguel spoke carefully, his outsider's perspective giving him unique clarity. Eleanor, I understand you're hurt. We all failed you today, and that's inexcusable. But are you certain this is the legacy you want to leave? This kind of division? Eleanor studied Miguel, appreciating his honesty, even as she rejected his premise. Miguel, for the past decade, I've watched this family become increasingly divided despite my efforts to hold it together. David treats me like an embarrassment, to be managed. Sarah treats me like a problem to be solved. I've been excluded from decisions about family gatherings, uninvited from social events, and now literally erased from family photographs. The division already exists. I'm simply making it official. David stopped pacing and faced his mother, directly. So this is it? One mistake, one thoughtless decision, and you're willing to destroy our family? One mistake? Eleanor's voice rose for the first time that evening. David, this isn't about one photograph. This is about years of dismissive treatment, condescending explanations, and the gradual erosion of my place in this family. The portrait was simply the moment I finally saw clearly what had been happening all along. Jessica stood up suddenly, tears streaming down her face. Stop! All of you! Just stop! Her young voice carried the moral authority that only comes from genuine heartbreak. Grandma L, I love you, but I don't want Dad's money if it means our family falls apart. And Dad? How could you leave Grandma out of our picture? That's the meanest thing I've ever heard. The room fell silent as Jessica's words hung in the air. Here was the voice of the next generation, uncontaminated by years of accumulated resentment and compromise, speaking truth that cut through all the adult complexity. David looked at his daughter, seeing his own behavior reflected in her disappointed eyes. For the first time that evening, his defensive posture cracked completely. Jess, I thought. You thought what, Dad? That Grandma wouldn't notice? That she wouldn't care? Or did you think she'd just accept being treated badly because she always has before? Eleanor felt a surge of pride in her granddaughter's courage, but also a deep sadness that a 16-year-old had to be the moral compass for a room full of adults. Jessica's right, Eleanor said quietly. I have accepted being treated badly because I thought that was what love required. I thought that if I just loved you enough, if I just gave enough, sacrificed enough, enabled enough, you would eventually love me back the way I remembered from when you were children. Sarah was crying openly now. We do love you, Mom. We've Always loved you. No, Sarah, you've always needed me. There's a difference. Eleanor's voice was gentle, but unwavering. Love doesn't exclude. Love doesn't dismiss. Love doesn't make someone feel like they're too much trouble to include in a family photograph. David sat down heavily, his head in his hands. When he looked up, his face showed the first genuine emotion Eleanor had seen from him in years. Not anger or defensiveness, but something approaching remorse. What do you want from us, Mother? How do we fix this? Eleanor looked around the room at her family. David finally showing vulnerability, Sarah confronting her own cowardice, Miguel providing steady support, and Jessica modeling the kind of authenticity they all needed to learn. I want you to understand that love requires action, not just sentiment. I want you to treat me like someone whose feelings matter, not like a burden to be managed. And I want you to prove that you're capable of change, not just apology. The legal documents remained on Eleanor's lap, their presence a reminder that words alone would no longer be sufficient. Her family would have to choose between their comfortable patterns of dysfunction and the harder work of authentic relationship. The next move was theirs. The silence stretched until David finally lifted his head from his hands, his face bearing the haggard expression of someone whose carefully constructed world had just collapsed. When he spoke, his voice carried none of its usual authority. Mother, I need you to understand something. The portrait decision wasn't about being embarrassed by you. It was about... He struggled with words, his lawyer's precision failing him for once. It was about control, about creating the image I thought we needed to project. Eleanor watched her son with the careful attention of someone who had waited decades for this moment of honesty. Control over what, exactly? Over how people see our family. Over the narrative. David's voice grew quieter. After Dad died, after you started getting more outspoken about family decisions, I thought it would be easier to manage everyone's expectations if we simplified things. Simplified? Eleanor repeated the word with the same distaste she might use for profanity. You mean if you erased me from the family story while I was still alive to witness it? David flinched. When you put it like that. That's exactly what it was, David. Don't soften it with euphemisms. Eleanor's voice remained steady, but Miguel noticed her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the legal documents. You decided I was inconvenient to your image, so you edited me out. Jessica, who had been standing in the center of the room like a witness to a car accident, suddenly moved to her grandmother's chair. Without asking permission, she perched on the armrest and took Eleanor's hand, her teenage directness cutting through the adult complexities. Grandma Elle, can I ask you something? Jessica's voice was still thick with tears, but it carried the kind of courage that comes from moral clarity. Are you doing this because you want to hurt Dad, or because you want him to understand how much he hurt you? The question stopped everyone cold. Out of the mouths of babes, Eleanor thought, remembering Bobby's similar inquiry about justice versus revenge. But hearing it from Jessica, innocent, honest Jessica, gave it different weight. Both, Eleanor answered honestly. And I'm not proud of that, sweetheart. But sometimes people need to experience loss before they understand what they've been taking for granted. Jessica nodded solemnly, then turned to face her father with the fearless honesty that only 16-year-olds possess. Dad, when you decided to leave Grandma out of the picture, did you think about how it would make her feel? David's face crumpled slightly. I told myself she wouldn't really mind, that she'd understand it was about presentation, not personal feelings. But that's stupid, Jessica said with devastating simplicity. Of course she'd mind. Of course her feelings would be hurt. You wouldn't leave me out of a family picture, would you? Never, David said immediately, then stopped as the implications of his own response hit him. The speed of his answer revealed everything about his assumptions, that Jessica's feelings mattered in ways Eleanor's apparently didn't. Miguel spoke for the second time that evening, his teacher's instincts recognizing a teachable moment. "David, why is it different with your mother?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. David looked around the room, at his daughter's disappointed face, at Sarah's guilty expression, at Miguel's patient expectation, at his mother's unwavering gaze. "Because," David's voice broke slightly, "because I've spent so many years trying to prove I was successful enough, sophisticated enough, worthy enough of the life you and Dad gave me. And somewhere along the way, I started seeing Mom as a reminder of where I came from instead of the reason I was able to get where I am." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition that her son was finally speaking truth instead of justification. Sarah wiped her eyes and spoke for the first time in several minutes. "I did the same thing, didn't I? I've been so focused on avoiding conflict that I forgot the most important conflict to have was the one that protected you." Miguel moved to sit beside his wife, his steady presence anchoring the emotional chaos. "Sarah, what would you tell a family in your practice if they came to you with this situation?" Sarah's professional training kicked in despite her personal turmoil. "I'd tell them that family systems break down when some members become acceptable casualties for others' comfort. I'd tell them that avoiding conflict doesn't create peace. It just lets problems fester until they explode." "And what would you recommend?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious about her daughter's professional perspective on their personal crisis. "I'd recommend honest communication about needs and boundaries. I'd suggest that the family members who caused harm take responsibility for repair, not just apology." Sarah looked directly at her mother. "And I'd probably recommend consequences to ensure the harmful patterns don't continue." Eleanor almost smiled. "So you think I'm handling this correctly?" "Professionally, yes. Personally?" Sarah's voice wavered. "It's terrifying to think we might lose you because we were too selfish and cowardly to treat you right." Jessica squeezed Eleanor's hand. "Grandma Elle, if Dad really understands now, if he really gets how wrong he was, could you maybe not take away everything? I mean, I don't want his money anyway. I just want our family to be okay." Eleanor looked at her granddaughter's hopeful face, then around the room at her family. David appeared genuinely shaken, his usual arrogance replaced by something that looked like remorse. Sarah had stopped making excuses and started taking responsibility. Miguel continued to ask the right questions, pushing everyone toward honesty. But Eleanor also remembered 30 years of similar moments, times when crisis had seemed to create breakthrough, only to have old patterns reassert themselves once the immediate consequences passed. "Jessica, sweetheart, I appreciate what you're asking, but I need to see change in action, not just in words. Your father and aunt have promised to do better many times before." David straightened, some of his lawyer's precision returning. "What would convince you? What do we need to do to prove we've learned from this?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. She'd spent the day moving from hurt to anger to determination. But Jessica's presence and David's apparent breakthrough were shifting something again. Not back to enabling, never that, but toward a different kind of boundary setting. "I want weekly family dinners here, at this house, for the next 6 months. No excuses, no last-minute cancellations, no work emergencies that are more important than showing up. I want to be included in family decisions that affect me. And I want a new Christmas portrait, one that includes everyone who matters." She paused, looking directly at David. "But most importantly, I want you to understand that this will is staying exactly as it is until I see sustained change, not just crisis-motivated promises. Jessica will inherit everything I've built not because I'm angry, but because she's the only one who's consistently treated me like family." David nodded slowly, the weight of real consequences finally registering. And if we do all that, if we prove we can change? Eleanor's smile was small but genuine. Then we'll talk about what family legacy really means. But David, understand this. I'm not negotiating from weakness anymore. I'm done accepting crumbs of affection from the family I devoted my life to building. The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, less hostile, more contemplative. Eleanor had drawn her line in the sand, and her family would have to decide whether to cross it or stand on their side of the divide. The next 6 months would tell them all who they really were when the comfortable lies were no longer available. 3 weeks after Christmas, Eleanor stood at her kitchen window watching David's BMW navigate the snowy driveway for the 3rd consecutive Sunday dinner. The sight still surprised her, not just his punctuality, but the way he climbed out of the car without his usual air of obligation, as if he might actually want to be here. The weekly dinners had begun awkwardly, with stilted conversation and careful politeness that felt like walking on ice. But something was shifting, incrementally and authentically. Last Sunday, David had stayed after dinner to help Dot with dishes. Something Eleanor couldn't remember him doing since he was a teenager required to earn his allowance. "He's early again," Dot observed, stirring her famous beef stew at the stove. "3rd week in a row. That boy's either had a personality transplant or he's finally figuring out what he lost." Eleanor smiled despite herself. Maybe both. Sarah's car pulled in behind David's, followed by Miguel's Toyota. Through the window, Eleanor watched her family emerge with what looked like genuine anticipation rather than dutiful resignation. Jessica bounded toward the house with her usual energy, but now David and Sarah followed at a more relaxed pace, talking quietly together instead of maintaining their customary polite distance. The front door opened with the easy familiarity Eleanor had been missing for years. "Grandma Elle!" Jessica's voice carried from the hallway, followed by the sound of boots being properly removed and coats hung in the closet. Small courtesies that Eleanor had stopped expecting but never stopped wanting. David appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expensive suit replaced by jeans and a sweater that made him look younger, more like the son she remembered. "Mother, I brought something for you." He held out a small wrapped package with the slight nervousness of someone unsure of their welcome. Eleanor accepted the gift, noting that David had wrapped it himself, rather than having his assistant handle the task. Inside, she found a small leather photo album filled with pictures she'd never seen, candid shots from David's childhood that Victoria must have taken. David at his high school graduation, looking at Eleanor with unguarded pride. David on his wedding day, dancing with her at the reception with genuine joy. David holding newborn Jessica, his face soft with wonder as Eleanor coached him through supporting the baby's head. "Where did you find these?" Eleanor's voice caught slightly. "I asked Victoria to go through her old photos. I wanted to remember." David's voice trailed off, then strengthened. "I wanted to remember who we used to be before I forgot how to see you clearly." Sarah appeared beside her brother, and Eleanor noted how they stood together now, not the careful distance of recent years, but the easy proximity of siblings who'd rediscovered their shared history. "I brought something too," Sarah said, producing an official-looking folder. "It's a proposal for the family foundation you mentioned. I researched organizations that help families heal from communication breakdowns, and I thought maybe we could create something that reflects what we've learned." Eleanor opened the folder to find detailed plans for the Whitman Family Healing Foundation, complete with mission statements, funding structures, and partnerships with family therapy organizations across Vermont. The thoroughness revealed hours of work, genuine thought about legacy and repair. "Sarah, this is remarkable. You did all this research yourself?" "Miguel helped with the educational components, and I used some of my professional contacts for the family therapy partnerships. But yes, I wanted to show you that I understand what you were trying to teach us about using our resources for healing instead of just accumulation." Miguel joined them in the kitchen, carrying a manila envelope of his own. "Eleanor, I hope you don't mind, but Jessica asked me to help her with something." Jessica practically vibrated with excitement as Miguel handed Eleanor the envelope. "Open it, Grandma Elle. Open it." Inside, Eleanor found a collection of essays Jessica had written for her English class, all centered on the theme of family legacy and the difference between inherited wealth and inherited wisdom. The writing was sophisticated beyond Jessica's years, grappling with complex questions about privilege, responsibility, and the courage required for authentic relationship. But it was the final essay that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. Titled, "The Portrait of Real Family," it described Christmas evening from Jessica's perspective. The shock of learning about the exclusion, the pain of watching her family fracture, and the hope she'd felt when her grandmother refused to accept mistreatment disguised as love. "My grandmother taught me that families can choose to grow or choose to repeat the same mistakes forever," Jessica had written. "She showed me that love isn't just a feeling. It's a decision to include people, to consider their feelings, to make them feel valued instead of tolerated. The most important inheritance she's giving me isn't money. It's the knowledge that I deserve to be treated with kindness, and that I have the responsibility to treat others the same way." Eleanor set down the essay with trembling hands. "Jessica, this is beautiful and wise, far wiser than most adults manage. I've been thinking a lot about what you said at Christmas, about the difference between being needed and being loved. I realized I want to love people the right way, not just need them for what they can give me." David cleared his throat, his face showing the emotional strain of someone unaccustomed to vulnerability. "Mother, I need to tell you something. This week, I withdrew my partnership application from the most prestigious firm in Boston. I realized I'd been so focused on impressing people who don't matter that I'd forgotten to pay attention to the people who do." Eleanor studied her son's face, noting the absence of his usual defensive posture. That must have been a difficult decision. It was liberating, actually. Terrifying, but liberating. I'd been chasing other people's definitions of success for so long that I'd forgotten what actually matters to me. He paused, looking around the kitchen that had been the heart of his childhood. "I want to spend more time here, in Vermont. Maybe help expand the maple syrup business instead of abandoning it for corporate law." Sarah reached for her mother's hand. "Mom, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Are we doing enough? Are we changing in ways that matter? Or are we just performing change because we're scared of losing our inheritance?" The question hit Eleanor like a physical blow, not because it was painful, but because it represented the kind of honest self-examination she'd been hoping to see from her children for years. "Sarah, the fact that you can ask that question tells me everything about whether the change is real. People who are just performing don't interrogate their own motives that deeply." Eleanor looked around the kitchen at her family, David showing genuine vulnerability, Sarah asking hard questions about her own authenticity, Miguel providing steady wisdom, and Jessica modeling the kind of courage and honesty they all needed to learn. "I have something to tell all of you," Eleanor said, reaching for the manila envelope she'd asked Bobby to prepare earlier that week. "I've made another change to the will." The room went quiet, but this time the silence felt different, less fearful, more curious. "The business and properties will still go to Jessica when she turns 25, but I've added provisions for all of you. David, if you're serious about working with the maple syrup business, there's a partnership structure that honors both your contributions and Jessica's inheritance. Sarah, the foundation you've designed will be fully funded, with you as the executive, director if you want the position." Eleanor paused, looking at each of their faces. "But these provisions only activate if we can sustain the changes we've made. Weekly dinners for the rest of this year. Honest communication when conflicts arise. And, most importantly, a commitment to treating each other as whole people worthy of consideration, not just sources of obligation or resources to be managed." David's relief was visible, But so was his understanding that Eleanor's trust would have to be continually earned rather than simply assumed. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said, pulling out a final envelope. "Jessica suggested we take a new family portrait, and I think it's time. But this one will be different. No formal poses, no artificial staging. Just us, as we actually are, in the places that matter to us." As her family began discussing plans for their new portrait, a real one this time, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the genuine anticipation of spending time with people who wanted to be with her. Not because they had to, but because they chose to. The road home had been longer and more difficult than any of them had expected, but they were finally traveling it together. 6 months later, on a warm Sunday in June, Eleanor stood in her kitchen watching her family prepare for what Jessica had dubbed the real family portrait. But this time, instead of a formal studio session, they'd decided to document a day, authentic moments of connection rather than artificial poses. The morning had begun with David arriving early to help with the maple syrup processing, something he'd been doing every weekend since February. Eleanor watched through the window as he and Miguel worked together in the sugar house, David's expensive loafers long since replaced by practical work boots. His laugh carried across the yard as Miguel shared a story about his students, and Eleanor marveled at how relaxed her son looked when he wasn't performing success for an invisible audience. Sarah emerged from the garden with Dot, both women, carrying baskets of herbs and early vegetables. Sarah's weekly visits had evolved into genuine partnership. She'd taken over much of the garden planning, applying the same methodical care to growing vegetables that she brought to healing families. The sight of her daughter working alongside Dot, their conversation punctuated by easy laughter, filled Eleanor with quiet satisfaction. "Grandma Elle, are you ready for your close-up?" Jessica appeared in the kitchen doorway, camera in hand, grinning with the confidence of someone who'd spent the past 6 months learning what authentic family looked like. Eleanor laughed, wiping her hands on the dish towel. "I think I've been ready for this picture my whole life, sweetheart." The day unfolded with the natural rhythm they'd developed over months of weekly gatherings. No one checked their phone. During lunch, no one made excuses to leave early. When conflicts arose, and they did, because real families disagree, they addressed them directly instead of letting resentment simmer beneath polite surfaces. During lunch, David surprised everyone by raising his glass in a toast. "To Mother, who taught us that love requires action, not just intention, and who had the courage to demand better from all of us, even when it would have been easier to accept less." Eleanor felt tears threaten, but they were different from the tears she'd shed on Christmas morning. These tears came from joy rather than pain, from inclusion rather than exclusion. "To second chances," Sarah added, "and to families brave enough to change." As the afternoon progressed, Jessica captured moment after moment, not the artificial smiles of formal portraits, but the genuine expressions of people who enjoyed each other's company. Eleanor teaching Jessica to knead bread dough, David and Miguel discussing books they'd both been reading, Sarah and Dot planning next year's garden expansion, the whole family working together to prepare dinner, their movements synchronized by months of practice. But it was the evening moment that would become the portrait Eleanor treasured most. As the sun set over the Vermont mountains, the family gathered on the front porch, the same porch where Eleanor had sat alone so many Christmas mornings, watching other families create memories while feeling excluded from her own. Jessica set up the camera timer and ran to join them, settling between Eleanor and David on the porch swing Harold had built 40 years ago. But instead of formal poses, they simply sat together, talking and laughing as the camera captured their natural interactions. When Jessica later printed the photos, one image stood out immediately. In it, Eleanor sat surrounded by her family, but not as a matriarch presiding over subjects. Instead, she appeared as herself, a woman engaged in genuine, Conversation with people who clearly valued her presence. David leaned forward, listening intently to something she was saying. Sarah's hand rested naturally on her mother's shoulder. Miguel smiled with the warmth of someone who'd found his place in this family through patience and integrity. And Jessica, caught mid-laugh at something her grandmother had whispered, embodied the joy that authentic relationships create. Later that evening, as the family prepared to leave, David lingered in the kitchen where Eleanor was wrapping leftovers for everyone to take home. "Mother, I need to tell you something I should have said months ago. I'm proud to be your son. Not because of what you built or what you gave me, but because of who you are. Your strength, your integrity, your refusal to accept less than you deserved. Those are the qualities I want to inherit." Eleanor set down the dish towel and really looked at her son. The entitled, image-conscious lawyer was still there, but underneath, she could see glimpses of the boy who'd once promised to love her forever. "David, the greatest gift you can give me isn't an inheritance. It's the knowledge that you'll pass on the good parts of what you learned here to Jessica's generation." Sarah joined them, wrapping her arms around both her mother and brother in a spontaneous embrace that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. "Mom, I was thinking about something Jessica wrote in one of her essays. She said that families are like photographs. They can be artificial compositions that hide the truth, or they can be honest captures of people who choose to love each other as they really are." Eleanor thought about the original Christmas portrait, still tucked away in Harold's desk drawer. She'd kept it not as a reminder of pain, but as evidence of how far they'd traveled. That portrait represented the family they'd pretended to be, polished, perfect, carefully curated. The new photos represented the family they'd chosen to become, authentic, complicated, but genuinely connected. As her family finally departed, Eleanor sat on the front porch with Dot, both women watching the taillights disappear down the mountain road. "You did it," Dot said simply. "You got your family back." Eleanor considered this. "No, I think we all did it together. I just finally learned the difference between enabling dysfunction and demanding love. And now?" Eleanor smiled, feeling more at peace than she had in years. "Now I know that the most valuable inheritance I can leave isn't money or property. It's the example of how to break cycles, how to demand authenticity, and how to love people enough to refuse to accept their worst behavior." The next morning, Eleanor called Bobby Caldwell to make one final change to her will. The provisions she'd outlined to her family would remain, but she added a new element, a letter to be read to Jessica on her 25th birthday, explaining not just what she was inheriting, but why. "Dear Jessica," the letter began, "by the time you read this, you'll understand that the greatest inheritance isn't wealth, it's wisdom. You're receiving these resources not because you were my favorite, but because you consistently chose kindness over convenience, honesty over performance, and love over obligation. Use this inheritance to build the kind of family where everyone feels seen, valued, and included. And remember that the portrait of a real family isn't perfect. It's honest." Eleanor sealed the letter with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally learned the difference between leaving a legacy and earning one. The Christmas portrait that had broken her heart had ultimately saved her family, forcing them all to confront the difference between performing love and practicing it. As she placed the letter in the safe beside Harold's desk, Eleanor's eyes fell on the new family photos Jessica had printed and framed. In every image, she saw people who'd chosen to grow rather than repeat old patterns, who'd learned that love requires courage, and who'd discovered that authentic relationships are worth the difficult work they require. The true portrait of her family wasn't hanging on any wall. It lived in the weekly dinners, the honest conversations, the shared work in the garden and sugar house, and the knowledge that they'd all chosen each other not out of obligation, but out of genuine affection. Outside her window, the maple trees stretched toward the sky, their roots deep in Vermont soil, their branches reaching toward something better. Like her family, They'd weathered storms and grown stronger, proving that the best things in life, love, trust, forgiveness, couldn't be rushed or forced, only nurtured with patience, consistency, and the courage to keep reaching toward the light. Eleanor smiled and went to call Jessica about plans for next Sunday's dinner. After all, some traditions were worth preserving, especially the ones built on love rather than mere legacy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.